try to get this thing to work. Okay, I think the first thing to note is that most of you went to school and came to university at a period of relatively prolonged stagnation in the world. The stagnation has been the story of the world largely since 2008, after 2008, during the time of the global financial crisis. But it also became very important, especially for developing countries in the world, and I suspect most of you are from developing countries, during the period since around 2014, when commodity price collapsed very dramatically. Now, I think it's important to understand why all this has happened. And I think it's useful for us to recognize that the response of the West to the global financial crisis was not to try to stimulate the world economy, to get economic activity going, as old-timers of my generation or generations before me would have tried to do, people who were influenced by Keynesian economic thinking, for instance. Instead, what we have seen is a very unusual innovation of what has been conventional monetary policies, and specifically involve what is called quantitative easing, making available finance not primarily to the public sector, but rather to the private sector. And this became extremely important and allowed the availability of finance to offset the adverse effects of the depression. But what this also meant is that more and more people borrowed. And so, you especially, are now in a generation of the indebted. Not indebted to God, not indebted to anything else, but rather indebted to finance. We are living in a world of financialization. And this, I think, is extremely important for us to recognize. Especially now, since what we have seen in the last year and a half or so has been the steady increase of interest rate hikes. Not because they are necessary, but because they have been influenced by the kind of economic policy thinking which dominates most central banks in the world, which dominates much of the economics profession in the world. And this, I think, we should think about very, very seriously. Let me try to adjust this. So what we see is, as a consequence of this, is a great deal of what is sometimes politely referred to as fiscal austerity. Governments all over the world are being squeezed. They are not able to spend. And this began in 2009. As soon as the initial interventions by governments to the global financial crisis seemed to work, people in the West especially announced that the green buds of recovery were evident and it was no longer needed to have fiscal stimulation. Instead, what we see has been fiscal austerity. And very famous economists, some of you may have heard of them, the late Alberto Alvecina from Harvard, Kenneth Rogoff from Harvard, Carmen Reinhardt from Harvard, and a bunch of other people, all were talking about how it was important for us to have fiscal austerity because they provided so-called evidence claiming that without austerity, you would have runaway accumulation of debt, and runaway accumulation of debt would result in catastrophe. This is what we were told by the economics profession during this period. Instead, I think it's important for us to recognize that we have a situation now which is of human making. It's not a natural catastrophe, but there are also so-called natural factors which have made things worse. And we all live, as you know, in the tropical zone. And in the tropical zone is the hardest hit by this phenomenon which is politely referred to as climate change. Some refer to it less politely as global warming. For some people now it is global heating. You have seen so-called once in a century phenomena, like the floods in Pakistan 9 years ago. The floods in Pakistan at that time were described as once in a century phenomena. And what happened last year? The second time in a decade. Okay? So once in a century suddenly became twice in a decade. This is the world in which we live in. In Bangladesh, you find that seawater is coming into the Sundarbans and into the rice fields. In Vietnam, at least 8 rice-growing provinces have seen seawater coming in. The erosion of the beaches is now very evident. All this is likely to happen to many of us with differing effects, of course. Some of you who are familiar with southern Kedah also know that seawater is now coming into what were once rice-growing areas. All this poses challenges to us in a direct way, but to the world as a whole more indirectly. And of course, the Ummah is much of the population which occupies the tropics. Okay? In Southeast Asia alone, as you know, there are more than 300 million, probably arguably about 400 million. In the rest of the world, most Muslims are to be found in the tropics. Okay? Some tropics are more arid, some tropics less arid, and so on. I was in Africa recently, and in West Africa, for example, West Africa is largely Muslim. North Africa is largely Muslim. The Sahel is almost entirely Muslim. The Horn of Africa is almost entirely Muslim. So these are all parts of the world which are being affected by depression, global warming. But together with that, we have war. Look at what has happened in Ethiopia. Poor people fighting with each other over what? You know? This is the situation we are in today. So if we do not recognize this, I think we would be doing the Ummah a great disservice, and we need to begin to come to terms with it. I noted earlier that from around 2013, the commodity prices went down, export prices went down, from after 2014, and we've also seen the deepening of contraction of the economic contraction which I referred to earlier, combining with inflation in the recent period. So initially, some of you may know that I was warning about the real threat of something which happened many before most of your lifetimes. During the 1970s, there was a phenomenon in the West which was called stagflation, economic stagnation together with inflation. Something which has not happened since then on any mass scale, but there was a real threat of this last year. But now I no longer believe that. And why? Because the facts have changed. Somebody said, oh, you're changing your mind about everything and so on and so forth. Yes, what is wrong with changing your mind? If the facts have changed, why don't you change your mind? You know, if you realize that you made a mistake before, why don't we admit that we have made mistakes? I think it's very important for us to have humility in the profession, and this is, I think, important. Now, the next thing to remember is, for a long time, we were all told that, open economies were best, trade liberalization was wonderful, and so on and so forth. Well, in case you haven't noticed, that period is over. Okay? The American government now offers something called the Indo-Pacific Strategy. IPS. The Indo-Pacific strategy basically doesn't even offer access to the US market. Okay? Because the US has begun to realize that they are not competitive in almost anything except what? Arms and a few other things. Even when they sold planes to us, and the planes had problems, they denied there were problems. They blamed it on Indonesian pilots, they blamed it on Ethiopian pilots. But as it turned out, there was something basically malfunctioning with the Boeing 737X. But they were all too happy to blame developing country pilots. This is the world in which we live, and the world believed Boeing when they claimed that. Of course, now it's been exposed as quite untrue. So I think it is important for us to realize that whatever you might think about globalization, that age of globalization, of trade globalization specifically, is largely over. Okay? So let us not presume, that the future of open economies such as Malaysia is assured by continuing to have open trade policies, as some politicians in this country would have us believe. And it's also very important for us to recognize that for all intents and purposes, the only multilateral organization for trade, which is supposed to handle disputes among countries, for example, which has been the World Trade Organization, only created in 1995, by the way, but that organization is not even allowed to function. When the US government did not get a decision by the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization to vote its way, what did they do? They refused to reappoint the Korean judge who had blocked this, and they refused to allow any other appointments. So much so that the dispute settlement mechanism could not function anymore. So even the creation of institutions by the very forces who have used it as a way of imposing their will on the rest of us basically are rendered dysfunctional when it suits them. So we have to begin to realize that this is not a world where we can assume many of the assumptions which we held dear for many, many generations. Certainly in my own lifetime, and I would say even before that. So what we have to now is a situation where the multilateral order is used when it suits the purposes of those who rule the world, and when it doesn't suit their purposes, it is dispensed with. So in 2001, there was this famous episode called 9/11. It was a tragedy. It was an attack on the World Trade Organization and the US Pentagon and the White House by certain forces who acted supposedly in the name of Islam. And there's no reason for any of us to associate with them, but they acted nonetheless. And this resulted in a period where Islam, instead of being known as a religion of peace, became known as a religion of war. This is now beginning to change. And one of the most decisive things which have caused this change actually is the recent understanding between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Okay? Something which was almost inconceivable for many of us, certainly for me, and for many others I suspect in this room as well. We never thought that this would be possible. And now that is over. So once again we have the real possibility of Islam realizing its potential and its promise of peace. Look at the number of places. The capital of Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, the name of Brunei, Darussalam, and so on and so forth. It is a land of peace. This is the promise of Islam, and we have to be very serious about this. But what does it mean? Is this going to be a world of peace? I fear that this is not going to be the case. So I think we need to begin to realize that we have a situation where the rules of the WTO, particularly something called TRIPS, I won't get into all that now, was used to block the availability of medicines, of equipment, of therapies, of tests for the world to cope with COVID-19. Instead, corporate greed was given primacy. And so the request by South Africa and India for a waiver of the TRIPS agreement was put aside. Now just remember that in 2001, right after 9/11, well over 100 countries, I can't even remember how many, at least I think about 120 countries offered the US direct help, and almost all Islamic countries supported the US at that moment. And in 1999, President Clinton had basically tried to push the American agenda very hard on the WTO in a meeting in Seattle, a ministerial meeting in Seattle. This was rejected, especially by African ministers. African ministers walked out of that meeting, and so the future of the WTO itself, 4 years after it was created in 1995, was in doubt. President Bush, probably one of the best things he ever did, George W. Bush, saw the opportunity to revive the WTO negotiations, and he made one major concession. And this was following President Mandela. President Mandela had been campaigning for something called the public health exception. In the public interest, in the interest of public health, the rules of intellectual property should be suspended. Okay. This is well known to people who study intellectual property rights law and so on. But what happened? When COVID-19 happened, when the Director General of the WHO, Tedros, declared a pandemic after 2 months, what happened? Immediately, the intellectual property rights should be suspended. But no, it was resisted, and the result was that there was no concession, and so it took a long time for tests, it took a long time for therapies, it took a long time for everything to be made readily and easily available. This was the response of the captains of industry in the world. So I think we need to begin to re-examine our assumptions about the world we live in, and we need to recognize the world in which we live. Now, together with all this, I think you all probably realize that is a world of new antagonisms. Now, Islam is no longer the enemy. Okay, there's a new enemy, and depending on who you talk to, it's either Russia or China. And in the interest of to deal with these new enemies, something which is the antithesis of trade liberalization is being introduced. What is this? They are called sanctions. They are called sanctions. So sanctions are the very antithesis of trade liberalization. Now sanctions are not new. Some of you may have seen films about the past, when the enemy surrounds a particular fortress or a city. What do? They impose a state of siege. It's a very cruel way of doing it. Basically, you're trying to starve those people until they surrender. Okay? And that's precisely what was done in ancient times and is what is being revived in the 21st century, to have imposed sanctions. This is basically what sanctions are. So to assume that we are living in a liberal world economy is actually a false assumption. We are not living in that world. Sanctions are a part of economic warfare, and economic warfare is a form of warfare. There is a very famous Baron von Clausewitz, who is a theoretician of war. Von Clausewitz said that basically war is the extension of politics. Well, economics has become an extension of war. This is the situation in which we live. And it's a very cruel way of because it does not recognize the distinction between those in uniform, those who bear arms, and those who do not bear arms. It does not recognize. Starve until they cry uncle. That is the nature of sanctions. That is the nature of laying a state of siege. So we have a situation now where we are not even talking about more market access. Even FDI now is subjected to political considerations. What happened when Trump was president, and when Abe Shinzo, yeah? He has to be distinguished from his father, Abe Shintaro, because Abe Shintaro was actually quite serious about peace. But Abe Shinzo was basically, somebody who was very belligerent. So the two of them agreed on one thing: we are going to do reshoring, take our industries back from China. But who wants those jobs in the US or Japan? They're not great jobs. Okay? If they're good jobs, they would have gone back. They would have stayed in the US a long time ago. So then they came up with a new idea called friendshoring. Okay? So we go to our friends, anybody but China, anybody but Russia. This is more or less the slogan of the times. Well, anybody but Iran too. But you know what the story is. So this is the world in which we live. So there is no longer any commitment to trade liberalization. There's no longer any commitment to liberal economics, and that's why I don't like the misnomer called neoliberalism, because there's nothing liberal about it, and I think this is to be remembered. So we have investment sanctions, we have technology sanctions. Remember that poor lady, the Chinese lady whose father was the man who started Huawei. She was basically a prisoner in a house. She was actually jailed for a few years, and then they couldn't find anything to charge her with, so finally they released her and then let her go back. But this is the kind of, so what is that? So trade, investment, technology, and finance. Okay? Russians and others cannot have swift financial transactions. So if you want to buy a ticket from Aeroflot because it's cheap to wherever you want to go, you're not making a declaration of political support for Russia, because you want to get the cheapest ticket available. You are now. It's going to be much more difficult. So we find that more and more everything is being drawn into this kind of situation. So the result of this greater belligerence in the world is deepening stagnation. And I think it's important to recognize that the pandemic, and since the pandemic, this economic warfare has resulted in what are what are politely referred to as where you have what are called supply side disruptions. Initially due to the pandemic also, but now increasingly due to sanctions. And what is the result of this? Can you hear me at the back? You can't hear me? Okay, so I'm sorry I can't do very much about your public address system, okay? But what we basically have is a situation where you have major disruptions. They're called supply side disruptions, and these supply side disruptions are not necessitated because they compound each other. For example, I don't know whether you ever watched the business news. Somebody was talking about freight costs. Freight costs from Malaysia to Los Angeles, sending stuff from Malaysia to Los Angeles. The price of freight, the freight charges did not go up 20%, 30%. They went up about 4 to 10-fold, depending on which line you were using. Why was this the case? Because it was supposed to come back empty. Okay? Especially if you had any remote Chinese connection. Okay? So basically, what has happened is that you have major supply side disruptions of this type. Not because the ships are not there, but because you introduce new routes. And so if we have let us say a group of 3 or 4 shipping lines, you want to expose only one of those shipping lines to further US restrictions. So the other 3, basically you use another port for transshipment. So you take from Guangdong or Shanghai, and you take it to some other intermediate port, maybe Manila, maybe Hong Kong, or something like that. And then all this means additional cost because you're moving containers from one ship to another, and so on and so forth. So all this creates delays and so on. These are all supply side disruptions of various types, which have unnecessarily raised the cost. Okay? You don't allow Russia to sell oil and gas. You even blow up the pipeline. Okay? Now, since when did all this become legitimate? Okay? You blow up a dam. You let floods take place. Generators are blown up. Electricity is cut off. Now all this is legitimate. These are all considered legitimate targets in war. So the result is huge economic disruptions as well, which has basically resulted in inflation. Now, I presume all of you have learned a little bit of macroeconomics. And what do you learn in macroeconomics? You learn that if you have a demand pull inflation, okay, if you have a demand pull inflation, you want to reduce the inflation by reducing demand. And you might raise interest rates. I'm not recommending it, but you might want to think about raising interest rates as one way of reducing demand to reduce inflation, due to consumption or due to investments. But here you have a situation where it's nothing to do with excess demand. In fact, it is the excess demand which is causing the prices to go up, because the demand remains the same, but you have cut the supplies. So prices go up. So what has happened? What has happened is that prices went up, especially in the West, especially in the US, all because of actions undertaken to disrupt supplies, and the result was food prices, etc., food and fuel prices particularly went up tremendously. And we are all suffering the consequences of this. But will raising interest rates help to bring down those food prices? No, they've got nothing to do with it. Okay? So anybody who has studied who understands the real world, you don't need to go to university to understand this. Anybody who thinks through the whole process will realize that it doesn't make sense. But that's precisely what is happening. And central bank governor after central bank governor will all tell you why they have to do it. And I can understand why so-called emerging markets and developing country central bank governors do it. Because if they don't do it, the US raises its interest rates, you don't raise interest rates, your money flows out. Okay? So you create a problem, your currency depreciates, etc., etc. A whole range of other problems. So you have a whole range of problems in the world, and you keep pushing up the interest rates and hoping that somehow or other the inflation will come to an end. Now I have shown, or my friends have actually shown it much better than I have, that after the middle of 2022, inflation in the US is no longer accelerating. Now I don't know how much macroeconomics have done, but in macroeconomics there's a concept called NAIRU. What does NAIRU mean? No worries, it's not a test. Non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay? It's based on the Phillips curve idea. Non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. The NAIRU. Okay? So if your inflation is not accelerating, it means that it is decelerating. That it is coming down. You don't expect prices to come down immediately. They are coming down. Okay? So what is the point of continuing to raise interest rates? It doesn't make sense. Okay? But that's precisely what the world is doing. Okay? So we are now deliberately creating the causes of the next depression. Now, you can be any side of the spectrum. You might say, oh, that's a Keynesian argument. Well, I can tell you that when you look at Milton Friedman's analysis of the Great Depression, he tells you what happened in 1937. 1937, the New Deal was already in place, the US economy was picking up. But what happened? The US Fed raised interest rates, and that brought it down. You ask another conservative, Ben Bernanke, who got a Nobel Prize for I don't know what, but Bernanke and his team did an analysis of oil price increases in 1970s. The oil price increases, as you all know, was due to OPEC getting its act together. But when interest rates were raised by the US Fed, Bernanke and his friends said it doesn't make sense. It caused the inflation, the inflation was there, it caused stagnation, which resulted in the phenomenon I was concerned about earlier, which is called stagflation. Okay? It was all created by bad policies, inappropriate policies, a failure to understand basic economics. Okay? As I said, it's basic. It's not, you don't need to have, okay, maybe not everybody understands NAIRU, okay? But everything else I've said, your grandfather knows, your grandmother understands. If you explain to her or to him, they will understand. You don't need a degree in economics to understand common sense. Okay? And that's basically what we have. So I think it's important for us to begin to realize that we have a situation where the stagnation is deepening, and we have now a lot of countries which are heavily indebted, and as a result of that heavy indebtedness, we have a very serious problem of debt, a big debt crisis about to explode. Okay? Now, so far, only a few countries have been affected, countries like Sri Lanka and so on, Zambia and so on, where there are extraordinary factors. But this threatens to become a problem comparable to what happened in the early 80s in Latin America, early 80s in Africa. Now, most of you don't learn economic history because most countries don't, universities don't teach economic history anymore. But if you try to understand what happened in the early 1980s, interest rates were pushed up by Paul Volcker to deal with the domestic American problem. It resulted in a lost decade as far as Latin America was concerned. It resulted in a lost quarter century as far as sub-Saharan Africa is concerned. So this is what we are up against, a problem which we need to begin to deal with, which is a real threat to the world. So I've already mentioned that this inflation due to war is causing fuel, food and fertilizer prices to go up. The reason why it is important for us to think carefully about the fertilizer prices is because the fertilizer prices, if you know, again, this is common sense. Any ordinary farmer will understand this. Okay? If your soil is not well nourished, it will starve the plants you grow in the soil. If your plants are not well, if your plants cannot grow, people are going to be poorly supplied with food. Okay? Soil nutrition, plant nutrition, human nutrition, all very, very interconnected. Okay? But what happens when you expect the soil nutrition to be replenished without providing fertilizer? Because now most places you have monocultures. You're producing the same crop over and over and over and over again. So you need fertilizer. Okay? And if you don't have fertilizer, what happens? So now we have a situation where the price of fertilizer for farmers all over the world is going up. Not because it has to, but because of this kind of supply side disruption. So I think the implications are very serious, not just for inflation in the abstract, for food sovereignty, for food security, and for a whole range of other issues. So also, I've already emphasized the various ways in which modern warfare is being fought and economic warfare is being waged. Trade, investment, technology, and finance. Okay, so and we have to recognize that this is not a very friendly world. Okay, there was a time when we always had very sweet words being expressed in international language about how the rich world wants to help the poor world and so on. Well, if you're under any illusions, forget it. That world is largely over. You can pretend to, since they are pretending, we can maintain the pretense also, but don't believe it for one thing. Okay? So look at what has happened recently. Yet another attempt to write the rules of the world, basically determining income distribution at the world level. Something called the OECD Inclusive Framework for Taxation. So, without getting into the long history of it, that deal is supposed to tax companies for their global income. Because companies have been getting away by shifting from one country to another and then avoiding tax in one country and trying to avoid paying as little tax as possible all over the world. There are companies which specialize in advising other companies on how to do this. They're called accountancy firms. And if some of you are doing accounting, you're probably going to apply to try to work in these accounting firms. okay, and advise your clients on how to minimize the tax they pay. Okay? This is what accountants do. Okay? You might not like me to say it so bluntly, but that's basically what it is. So that's what you're basically, that's what they have. So the Americans have long taxed American companies for their global income. The Europeans only tax within their own countries. So there's a basic incompatibility on the two sides of the North Atlantic. So now the OECD has brokered a deal where they're bringing together not only the both sides of the Atlantic, they're bringing together the whole world. Okay? They're bringing together the whole world. In principle, it can be a good thing to have universal taxation if you distribute it all fairly to the rest of the world. But what is the deal going to be? What do you think that how is the tax revenue going to be distributed? Anybody has any idea? No accountancy students? Okay, maybe after what I said you're a bit shy to well, the basic thing is that the accounting of these companies will have to be done in a standardized way, because you have to account for your entire revenue of your company. You can try to play around with your subsidiaries and all that, but basically you can't play around too much. There will be less room for avoiding taxes. But who will get the taxes? Okay. The principle now, firstly, the tax rate being imposed is being reduced. The commission which was set up to recommend a tax rate suggested 25%. Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, said 21%. The reason she said 21% because that's the US rate. So she can 21%, she doesn't need congressional approval. What did Boris Johnson do? You might think he's pretty stupid behind his hairstyle. Okay? But basically what he did was to reduce it to 15%. And he got the G7 to agree with him, and so it is now, that is the OECD. Because the OECD, frankly, is just a puppet of the G7 and basically of the US. Okay? So it's going to be 15%. Okay. 15%, okay, well, you know, you get 25%, 15%, okay. So, how is it going to be distributed? How do you think it should be distributed? For example, there are gold mining companies from all over the world mining gold in Tanzania. Tanzania is now the third largest gold miner in the world. Gold miner in Africa, sorry. South Africa number 1, Ghana number 2, Tanzania number 3. So how do you think it's going to be distributed? On the basis of where all these things are produced, or all the products which we produce in Malaysia? No. It's going to be produced on the basis of sales. It's going to be distributed on the basis of sales. So if you sell the gold in London, and you sell the gold in the US, that's where the money will accrue. The tax revenue will accrue. If you sell your electronic products made in Malaysia in Tokyo, that's where it will accrue. So the basis of distribution will be on the basis of consumption, not of production. Okay? Now, how much can developing countries consume? Most developing countries cannot consume very much, except for basic products like food. Okay? So you end up with a new tax deal, a great breakthrough of the 21st century. The new economic deal of the 21st century is basically going to benefit them. Okay? Now this is the kind of deal which we have. Meanwhile, they tell African countries, oh, you should not tax these gold mining companies. Let them. What we need the foreign direct investment. So I used the example of Tanzania earlier. How much gold? How much tax revenue does Tanzania get from gold mining in Tanzania? Third largest gold miner in Africa. How much? How much revenue do you think they get? Well, I apologize, it's a trick question. The answer is negative, because Tanzania subsidizes the gold mining companies by providing infrastructure, etc. Okay? So you don't get anything by providing the infrastructure, and then you don't tax them anything. Now this is world income distribution lesson 1. Do you teach any courses in world income distribution? I doubt it. Okay? Nobody teaches any courses in world income distribution. You always look within a country. Nobody talks about world income distribution. Okay? There's a Serbian economist named Branko Milanovic who has written some excellent stuff on this, but nobody teaches this stuff. Okay? Anyway, let me so what we have right now is this combination of factors: economic warfare and depressive economic policies which are taking the world into stagnation and depression. This is the situation. Okay? I have not said anything about Francophone West African countries. Anybody from Francophone West African countries? Okay. Francophone West African countries are doubly cursed. Okay? Yes, they are still using a currency which the French issue, and you have to have how much is it, 60 or 70% reserves in the French treasury to back it. This is the kind of system Malaysia had, and post-colonial Malaysia had until until Bank Negara was created, and then subsequently after 68, I think, okay, when the pound was devalued. Okay, this is the situation which we have. Now, how do you think the UK recovered after World War II? You think it recovered because of US Marshall Plan aid? You think it recovered for any other reason? Basic economic history of this country.
Colonialism.
Malaya, Peninsular Malaysia, contributed 70% of the foreign exchange earnings of the UK in the period 46-51. Okay? 46-51. This is why this is 70%. Okay? Because you have the UK was bombed by Hitler. There was hardly any industry left. Almost all the industries were hit by Hitler. So there was nothing left. And who was the one making the rockets to bomb Hitler? Later he became the head of NASA in the US, Donald von Braun. Okay? The man who built up NASA, National Aerospace Administration. So this is it's a simple economic history, but how many people know this? And some people will say, oh, we were never colonized. You know, Malaya was never colonized. The worst form of deception is self-deception. You know? The worst form of deception is self-deception. When you do not recognize what has happened to you. So, let me just emphasize that it has become popular I think the last time I came here, somebody asked about MMT. You all know what MMT is? You've heard of it? Modern monetary theory. I guess it's less popular now. But MMT is basically this view that you can just print money to solve problems. And it's very, very deceptively attractive. After all, what is the basis of money today? Okay. What is the basis of money? Right? So the view is that, oh, we can overcome all our fiscal constraints by just issuing money. Okay? So it's very now. Has anybody ever done it? Yes, the US does it all the time. The US does it all the time. But we are not the US. We are not the US. You can't just get away with it. There was a French finance minister who later became president. His name was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. And he described this as the exorbitant privilege. The privilege of the US to do this. And why does the US, how can the US get away with it? Well, until 1971, it was because of the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. But after 1971, what is it based on? Well, apparently one story goes that King Faisal agreed that all oil transactions would be in US dollars. But I'm not sure this was the case, and later on King Faisal was assassinated anyway. Nobody really knows, but let's face it, it's all because of confidence. People have confidence that the US-led world is going to prevail. It's basically comes down to it. So the result is that you have a situation where the US can do certain things, but that doesn't mean all of us can do it. So it's important for us to realize that this is a very serious problem. It's also important for us to realize that now, with interest rates rising and the level of indebtedness which we have in the world, not just governments, but people. You know the extent of debt of Malaysian households is over 80%. Okay? Yeah. 80% national income. So, you might not think about it very much, but for people like me who finished paying my housing debt within my working life, when I think about that some of the new proposals, 40-year loans, housing debt, that means you pay, and if something happens to you, your child pays, your children pay. These are some of the proposals which are coming up in this great scheme called financialization. Okay? You go and buy something, you pay twice the retail price because you are indebted. All this what do they call? Pay as you go schemes. So we have a situation where the country, like much of the rest of the world, has become heavily indebted. So household debt and corporate debt are serious problems together with sovereign debt or government debt. Okay? So we have to recognize that how this is all coming about. This is coming about largely due to policies which are emanating from Washington, and we need to begin to recognize that if that is the case, what we do. And I think I sent Dr. Aslam an earlier version of the slides. Okay? So this slide should come later, but since it's already come up, it's important to recognize that once upon a time, I used to think that the US is different from Europe, and of course it is different, and that there was some hope Europeans to help us to build, and particularly for Africa, this is a very strong belief that Europe will come to the Africans' help more than the US. Okay? But just read this quote. Please read the quote. Okay? Europe is a garden. The rest of the world is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden. In order to protect the garden, the gardeners have to go to the jungle. Otherwise, the rest of the world will invade us. Who's saying this? Mr. Joseph Borrell. Who is Joseph Borrell? He is the European Union High Representative. He is the number 2 in the European Commission. The number 2 after Ursula von der Leyen. Okay? This is his view of the rest of the world. Okay? This is his view of the world outside of Europe. Okay? He's a Catalan. In case you don't know Catalan is trying to get freedom from the rest of Spain. But this is the mentality of Mr. Joseph Borrell. Okay? And this is the mentality, unfortunately, of many people in Europe. So while once upon a time I would have hoped that we could get some help from the Europeans in dealing with the Americans and others, I am not sure anymore. When Malaysia tried to sell palm oil to Europe, guess what the vote was against Malaysian palm oil. That is palm oil from Southeast Asia. Anybody knows? More than 800 against 6 for Malaysia. 6, okay? Single digit. Triple digit and single digit. Okay? That was the vote, because the European Parliament is very large. Okay? So realistically speaking, this is what we can expect. Okay? So you have to wake up and forge new alliances. So basically what I'm arguing for is a new non-alignment. A non-alignment which is appropriate for our times. Non-alignment has been around for a long time. The non-alignment basically came about, probably first articulated not far from here in Bandung, Indonesia, in 1955. In 1961, the non-aligned movement was born in Belgrade, where there was a meeting of people like Tito. He hosted the meeting. Nkrumah from Ghana. I can't remember who else. Sukarno was there from Indonesia. Nehru was there, and so on. Okay. So the non-alignment was basically you don't take sides. It's like pepatah Melayu, gajah dengan gajah berjuang. What are you going to do? You're going to get involved? Oh, no. Forget it, okay? You just stay out of it. Okay? But because of the real threat of war, we have to be more than non-aligned. We basically have to be pacifist. We have to actually live up to the promise of Islam as a religion of peace. You have to be actively pacifist. Because the forces towards war are great. There's an organization called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And they have a so-called doomsday clock. Okay? They are now 90 seconds away from doomsday. The most dangerous ever in the history of the post-war period. 90 seconds away. Okay, just imagine the clock. Okay, 12 hours, we are 90 seconds away. You might not feel it here in the nice air conditioning in this room and so on, but this is the state of the world. And you might think, oh well, we are not doing anything to cause the war. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is nothing. Because there are people who do cause the war without even knowing what they're doing. I'll tell you a story which actually happened. during the pandemic in 2020, the U.S. the Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo, contacted the new Prime Minister of Malaysia and said, oh, we are very concerned about the situation in South China Sea, we want to have joint naval patrols. So, Prime Minister of Malaysia, very happy, U.S. Secretary of State calling him directly. So then he agreed. Fortunately, there was a fight within UMNO at that time. The former foreign minister was saying there are more than 1,000 Chinese incursions into Malaysian waters. And the then foreign minister said, no, there's no problem. No serious problem. These are all fake. Well, there were more than 1,000 so-called incursions consisting of fishing boats from China, fishing around the Spratleys, the islands which are disputed by Malaysia, Vietnam, China, and the Philippines. Okay? These are not settled things, and there were such fishing boats fishing around them. So, you can tell the same story from two different angles. If you want to start a war, you can say there are over 1,000 Chinese incursions. If you don't want to start a war, you can say, well, there are these things and we need to resolve this problem because it's not, we cannot just let it go on forever. But, so here was a politician trying to make a political comeback who exaggerated the problem and justified having the naval patrols, but the minister fortunately stopped it, and the defense minister who was responsible for appointing him, the defense minister supported it. So the defense minister and the foreign minister basically said no to the prime minister. Okay? And that's how we avoided getting into the war. Why was this happening? Because the US was considering all the options. Okay? You start a war with China, very dangerous. You start a war with Russia, dangerous. You start a war with Iran, you don't know whether they have nuclear weapons. Okay? So, the two places where they thought they could start a war without triggering a nuclear war were one, South China Sea, and two, Venezuela. But fortunately for all of us, the president of the US at that time said, I can't do the imitation. If anybody can do an imitation, please come do it. But basically, he said he's going to do it anyway. Of course, he didn't, but he said he was going to do it anyway. I don't need this. I don't need this war. Okay? So the most foul-mouthed president of the US ever was the one who basically stopped the war from starting here or in Venezuela. Okay? But the point, the reason I've taken some time to tell you this story is that it doesn't take much to start a war. You know, some little ambitious politician could have started the war because he thought he could make a comeback as a foreign minister, or whatever his calculation was, I don't know. And similarly, you can have all kinds of people making all kinds of calculations and going to war on a very dubious premise. So we have to be very, very careful about this. So there are all kinds of explanations. I won't go to, most of you are economic students, I won't go into Fukuyama, the end of liberalism, and the end of history, and so on and so forth. But the point is that you have a situation where the end of the First Cold War, okay, basically led to a world which in Washington they see it as a unipolar world. In the rest of the world, we see it as a multipolar world. Okay? But if you challenge the unipolar world, if you think that there was a unipolar world, anything which challenges that, including the idea of a multipolar world, is seen to be threatening. It seems to be a threat to empire. Okay? And many of the people who don't want to war right now with, say, Ukraine, there's a very famous international relations professor named John Mearsheimer. Okay? And he is very, very critical of the US in Ukraine. He's saying that the US is deliberately going to war in Ukraine, and it's a very, very dangerous situation. But what does it mean? What does this mean? It basically means that the US is causing that he wants the US to stop messing around in Ukraine. Why? Not because he wants peace, but because he wants to focus on China. Okay? So you have all kinds of, this is the point I'm trying to make, is that we are in a very dangerous world, and we have to really think about how the world has changed. We can't be fighting the old Cold War. The old Cold War was supposedly between democracy and communism and all this kind of thing. The world has changed. This is not the old Cold War. We are now living in a world of varieties of capitalism. Okay? Even in China, for all intents and purposes, you go and look in China, you have big corporations. These are capitalist corporations, okay, whether you like it or not. Okay? So this is not a situation where you are talking about a change of system. You are talking about a situation where you basically have capitalism versus capitalism, different types of capitalism. So we shouldn't get involved in this kind of situation. It is a very dangerous situation, and it's important for us to try to act in ways to avoid being drawn into this situation. It's a very, very dangerous situation. And that's why I'm pleading for us to revive the idea of non-alignment, a pacifist non-alignment, but also a non-alignment with an emphasis on international solidarity. Because we have real problems in the world. You take something like climate change. Okay? The world is getting very bad. Okay? Many West African countries can see the Sahel growing, the Sahara growing. The Sahara Desert is growing, is expanding. Not, we're talking about football fields every day. Okay? That's the pace of expansion. The aridification of the tropical grasslands in the savannah, and so on and so forth. This is happening. I once had the opportunity to fly from Italy to Buenos Aires, and the plane was postponed because there was a volcanic cloud which was moving, and so they had to fly at a time that we would arrive in Buenos Aires when the volcanic cloud was not over Buenos Aires. Okay? So the flight was postponed by about 13 hours. So I had the opportunity, it was supposed to be a night flight, but now, because of this postponement, I had the opportunity of seeing the Sahara from the air. And the Sahara from the air, there are not many clouds, right? Because it's so dry. But when you look at the Sahara from the air, you begin to see that once upon a time, there were great rivers there. There is still enough humidity that there is plant life below the sands, and you can still see the pattern of the rivers. Okay? This is what the Sahara once was. Okay? If we do not rectify our ways, we are going to destroy the planet. So there is a need, a desperate need to address climate change. Okay? And so we need to incorporate all this, and that is why the agenda of sustainable development is very, very relevant. What what did Malaysia start doing 25 years ago, after 25 years ago, the last 10, 15, last 15 years? It basically said, okay, the age of industrialization is over. It ended in 1997. Malaysia does not need to industrialize. We go to a higher level. Industry is considered secondary sector. We go to the tertiary sector. What is the tertiary sector?
Knowledge.
Services. And true, most of the jobs which have been created in the recent period have been in the tertiary, have been in services. But what are these service sector jobs? They are mostly in traditional services. Doing what? Financial services? All those people selling you all these gimmicks? Or what? So those jobs are being created, but are they enhancing the quality of human life? This is the question we need to ask ourselves. So we need to begin to challenge them. And what are the kinds of services we offer? Processing plastic waste. Most of you cannot remember this because you are too young, but the older ones here will know that almost 200 licenses were issued to process plastic waste. But 85% of the plastic waste which was imported into Malaysia to be processed couldn't be processed. So where did it go?
See.
Into landfills. And they will take hundreds, if not thousands of years to break down. And even after they break down, they will still be problematic. So we are creating problems for ourselves with a kind of a focus on growth and not caring about the condition of humanity and not worrying about the condition of nature. So when we acknowledge God as Rab Alamin, what do we say? Okay? The creator of the universe. What are we doing about the universe? We are the Khalifah Allah. What are we doing about that? What is our responsibility? So this is how we need to reaffirm our sense of human worth and to be deserving of this huge responsibility of being Khalifah Allah. Okay? And this is why I chose to speak about a subject which probably didn't appeal to many people. Why talk about war? Why talk about depression? Why talk about these rather unusual things? But I do hope to have persuaded you to at least think about these issues, even if I'm not persuaded you to try to do more and act decisively in favor of humanity, in favor of